The more you desperately want to be happy and loved, the lonelier and more afraid you actually become.
Right.
It sounds like a riddle, I know. But if you look closely at your own life, you'll probably find it staring right back at you. Wanting a positive experience is fundamentally a negative experience.
Because it highlights what you lack.
Exactly. And paradoxically, accepting a negative experience is actually a positive experience. Welcome to Summary Sanctum, everyone. I'm Alex.
And I'm Bailey. We are your narrators for this deep dive.
Yeah, and this concept we're starting with, it's wild. It completely upends the traditional self-help narrative we've all been force-fed since, well, childhood.
Oh, totally. We're constantly told to, envision success, manifest wealth, demand happiness, but that relentless pursuit is exactly what's making everyone so completely miserable.
So let's just jump straight into it, because our mission today is to tear apart that traditional narrative. We're taking a massive stack of source material centered around Mark Manson's wildly counterintuitive philosophy on living a good life.
Right, and we are going to extract the core mechanisms of how it actually works.
Yeah. The goal here isn't to tell you how to be happy.
No, not at all.
The goal is to give you a shortcut to understanding the subtle art of choosing exactly what to care about. And crucially, how to systematically let go of the things you just shouldn't care about.
To do that, we really have to examine why our modern obsession with, more happiness, more success, more stuff is essentially a psychological trap.
It really is. The material we are diving into is brutally honest.
Yeah, it argues that avoiding pain is just a biological impossibility, and that embracing our limitations, our inevitable failures, and ultimately, our own mortality is the only logically sound path to a life of actual meaning.
And to understand what a meaningful life looks like, we kind of have to start by looking at someone who represented the absolute antithesis of the modern, optimized, hyper-productive lifestyle.
Oh, right. We need to talk about Charles Bukowski.
Yes. Bukowski is the perfect entry point because his life completely short-circuits that whole myth of the American dream.
It really does. We're conditioned to believe that success comes to those who relentlessly optimize their habits, right? Practice daily affirmations, never give up.
Yeah, the whole hustle culture thing.
Exactly. Bukowski did literally none of those things.
He was a deadbeat, let's just be honest. An alcoholic, a chronic gambler, a cheapskate.
A total mess.
Right. For 30 years, he submitted his writing to every magazine and publisher he could find. And he faced just this massive mountain of rejections.
Because the literary establishment found his work crude and, well, disgusting.
Yeah. So he worked as a letter filer at a post office, made terrible money, spent it all on booze at the track, and would just wake up passed out on the floor.
He didn't have a morning routine.
No green juice for him.
Definitely no green juice.
Yeah.
He lived in this meaningless, basically self-destructive blur.
Which makes what happened at age 50 so incredibly fascinating.
Right, because after a lifetime of objective failure, an editor at the small independent publishing house took a weird interest in him.
Yeah, they offered him a really meager deal. And Bukowski famously replied, and I love this, he said, "I have one of two choices. Stay in the post office and go crazy, or stay out here and play it writer and starve. I have decided to starve."
Such a great quote. So he wrote his first novel, Post Office, in like 3 weeks. And he went on to sell millions of books.
Millions. But the way our culture digests his story is where the delusion really sets in.
Oh, 100%. People look at Bukowski and say, see, he never gave up. He persisted against all odds, and eventually his genius was recognized.
Right, we try to force his messy reality into this sanitized, inspirational movie montage.
We do, because the alternative makes us deeply uncomfortable. The reality is that his success didn't stem from some relentless, noble determination to be a winner.
No, it came from the exact opposite.
Exactly. He knew he was a loser, he fully accepted it, and he wrote about it with zero filter. He never tried to be anything other than a flawed, damaged human being.
Even after achieving massive fame and wealth, he would show up to poetry readings completely intoxicated and hurl insults at his own audience.
Yeah, success didn't magically cure his demons or make him a beacon of virtue.
His tombstone literally says, "Don't try."
That isn't a joke either. It's his entire philosophy.
Which brings us to why his comfort with being a failure is so critical for us to understand today.
Well, our current culture is obsessively focused on unrealistically positive expectations. I mean, every advertisement, every social media feed is screaming at you to be happier, be healthier, be richer, be sexier.
It's exhausting.
It is. But the psychological mechanism behind conventional life advice, all that relentless positivity, is that it forces you to fixate on what you lack.
Right. When you stand in front of a mirror and chant, "I am beautiful" or "I am successful," your brain is simultaneously registering the underlying reality.
Which is that you are only doing this because you fundamentally feel that you aren't those things.
It's the old Texas proverb, "The smallest dog barks the loudest."
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, a truly confident person doesn't need to stand in front of a mirror and convince themselves they are confident. They just are.
Exactly. The sheer act of trying to prove your worth reinforces the subconscious belief that you are worthless.
And this is the core of philosopher Alan Watts' concept of the backwards law.
Right. The backwards law. The harder we try with the conscious will to do something, the less we shall succeed.
Pursuing a positive experience is inherently a negative experience because it highlights your lack of it. But fully accepting a negative experience, accepting that you are awkward or struggling or currently failing, generates a positive experience.
It brings immense relief. The pain you voluntarily pursue in the weight room leads to the positive outcome of better health. The failures you endure in a startup lead to the positive outcome of understanding the market.
Right. The negativity is the prerequisite for the positive.
And there is a deeply biological reason why resisting the negative destroys us. The source material refers to this as the feedback loop from hell,
Which is a quirk of human neurobiology that every listener has experienced. Probably this week.
probably today. So the neocortex, the newest part of the human brain from an evolutionary standpoint, gives us this unique ability to have thoughts about our own thoughts.
Which is great for building skyscrapers and writing symphonies.
Yes, but it's disastrous for our emotional regulation.
Think about the last time you felt anxious about an upcoming confrontation. You feel the physical symptoms: tight chest, shallow breath. But then your neocortex kicks in and notices the anxiety.
And you start thinking, why am I so nervous? I shouldn't be nervous. This is stupid.
Exactly. Now you are experiencing anxiety about your anxiety. The compounding effect is crippling. Or, you get angry about someone cutting you off in traffic.
Right.
And then you get angry at yourself for letting such a trivial thing ruin your morning. You're suddenly feeling guilty about feeling angry.
It's a recursive spiral that just drills you deeper into misery, and consumer culture weaponizes this exact biological quirk.
Oh, completely.
We are bombarded with highly curated, algorithmic images of people living seemingly perfect, friction-free lives. So when you experience a perfectly normal human emotion like feeling sad or unmotivated for an afternoon, your brain compares it to the cultural baseline of perpetual happiness.
You immediately conclude there is something inherently wrong with you.
We have been socially conditioned to feel bad about feeling bad, which guarantees we will always feel bad.
I look at the feedback loop from hell like being stuck in quicksand. The physical mechanics of quicksand are a perfect mirror for this.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Yeah, when you step into it, your evolutionary survival instinct screams at you to panic. You thrash around, you fight, you try to pull your legs out.
But quicksand is a non-Newtonian fluid.
Right. The more friction and force you apply to it, the more solid it becomes and the faster it pulls you under. Struggling to escape, pursuing the positive outcome, is the exact mechanism that kills you.
To survive quicksand, you have to do something completely counterintuitive. You have to relax.
You have to stop fighting, lay back, and increase your surface area so you can float. You have to completely accept the negative situation in order to survive it.
Which means the only way to short-circuit the feedback loop from hell is to look at your own anxiety or your own sadness and say, I feel terrible today, and who cares?
Yes. The moment you stop giving a damn about your negative emotions, they lose their power over you. You stop the recursive loop.
But this naturally raises a massive question.
So what's that?
If actively pursuing happiness is what makes us miserable, and if the solution is to just accept feeling terrible, then what is the point? Where does actual happiness come from?
That is the big question. To answer that, we have to completely dismantle how society defines happiness. We treat happiness like it's an equation to be solved or a destination on a map.
Like, once I get the promotion, then I'll be happy. Once I find the right partner, then I'll be happy.
Right. But happiness isn't a state of being. It's an active process.
The story of the Buddha illustrates the failure of the destination mindset perfectly.
Oh yeah, go into that.
Long before he was a spiritual leader, he was a prince. His father, the king, received a prophecy that his son would either become a great ruler or a great holy man.
And the king obviously wanted a great ruler.
Exactly. So he decided to completely shield the prince from the realities of human suffering. He built high walls around the palace compound. He surrounded the boy with endless feasts, beautiful servants, and every conceivable luxury.
The prince grew up literally unaware that sickness, aging, and death existed.
He lived in a manufactured utopia of pure positivity. But instead of being perfectly happy, the prince was fundamentally empty.
Because the endless luxury meant nothing because there was no contrast.
Right. So he sneaks out of the palace one night, and for the first time, he sees a sick man, an old man, and a decaying corpse.
Which just shatters his entire worldview.
It shatters him. He realizes that his father's protective bubble was a lie, and he experiences a profound existential crisis.
He swings the pendulum to the absolute opposite extreme.
He abandons his wealth, escapes into the wilderness, and decides to embrace suffering.
He starves himself, lives on the streets, and begs for scraps of food alongside ascetics. He does this for years, punishing his physical body in the belief that extreme deprivation will yield spiritual enlightenment.
And after years of agonizing pain, what does he discover? Pointless suffering is just as empty and meaningless as pointless wealth.
Starving in the dirt didn't make him any more fulfilled than eating grapes on a silk pillow.
Exactly. He finally sits under a tree, refusing to move until he figures out the nature of existence, and he arrives at a foundational realization.
Which is that life itself is inherently a form of suffering.
It's inescapable. The rich suffer because of the complexities and paranoias of their riches. The poor suffer because of the brutal realities of their poverty.
The single person suffers from loneliness. The married person suffers from the friction of intimacy.
Status and wealth do not eliminate suffering. They simply change the flavor of the problems you have to deal with.
This concept is so vital that the source material introduces a brilliant metaphorical superhero to drive it home.
Oh, disappointment panda.
Yes, Disappointment Panda. He wears a cheesy eye mask and a shirt with a giant T for truth. His superpower isn't flying or super strength. It's going door to door, telling people the harsh, uncomfortable truths they desperately need to hear, but spend their lives running away from.
Disappointment panda shows up at your door and says, making a lot of money won't make your kids love you, or your chronic unhappiness is mostly your own fault.
We avoid these truths because they cause psychological pain. But Disappointment Panda understands something crucial about biology. Pain is a feature of the human system, not a bug.
Think about physical pain. If you accidentally touch a hot stove, the searing pain in your hand is excruciating. But that pain is incredibly useful.
It is a rapid response feedback mechanism generated by your nervous system to inform you of your physical limits.
Right, without that pain, you would leave your hand on the stove until it burned to the bone. People born with congenital insensitivity to pain often die young because they don't know when they are injured.
Pain is nature's preferred agent for inspiring change.
And psychological pain functions exactly the same way. When you feel the sting of rejection, the ache of loneliness, or the frustration of failure, your brain is sending you a signal.
It's an indication that some equilibrium has been lost, that a boundary has been crossed, or that a strategy isn't working. Negative emotions are a call to action.
They are biologically designed to make you do something differently.
But because we've bought into the myth that we are supposed to be happy all the time, we treat psychological pain as an error in the system.
We try to numb it with alcohol or distraction or toxic positivity. And in doing so, we ignore the very feedback mechanism designed to help us navigate life.
Which brings us to the psychological concept of the hedonic treadmill.
Humans are incredibly adaptable creatures. When something good happens, you buy a new car, you get a raise, you experience a spike in dopamine.
But very quickly, your brain establishes a new baseline. The new car just becomes the car. The new salary just becomes what you need to pay your new, more expensive bills.
You are constantly running on the treadmill, working exhausting hours to change your life situation, but your internal level of happiness never actually changes for very long.
Because problems never go away. They just get upgraded.
Yeah.
Like, a homeless person has money problems. They don't know how to buy their next meal. Warren Buffett also has money problems. He has to figure out how to allocate billions of dollars across global markets to avoid massive economic fallout.
Buffett's problems are objectively better, but they are still problems that cause stress and require effort.
Therefore, if problems are constant and the hedonic treadmill prevents permanent satisfaction, the only logical conclusion is that happiness comes from the act of solving problems.
Happiness is an activity. It requires having something meaningful to solve.
But people constantly sabotage this process in two distinct ways. The first is denial.
Right, you pretend your problems don't exist. You distract yourself with endless scrolling, substance abuse, or superficial relationships. You get a quick, shallow high, but the underlying rot remains and worsens.
The second way is the victim mentality. You acknowledge the problem, but you convince yourself there's absolutely nothing you can do about it.
You blame the economy, your parents, your boss, or society at large. Both denial and victimhood are ultimately just defense mechanisms designed to help you avoid the short-term pain of actually confronting and solving the problem.
Which leads us to what might be the most important diagnostic question of your life.
What's that?
When people are asked what they want, they almost always answer with the positive outcomes. I want to be a successful entrepreneur, or I want a loving marriage, or I want a great physique.
It's a useless question because everyone wants the same positive things.
Exactly. The defining metric of your life isn't what you want to enjoy. The real question is, what pain do you want to sustain?
It's the ultimate filter. Everyone wants the corner office and the CEO title. But do you want the 60-hour work weeks, the agonizing decisions about laying people off, the corporate politics, and the constant stress?
If you want the title, but not the grind, you don't actually want the job.
Everyone wants the amazing physique, but not everyone wants to legitimately appreciate the pain of muscle hypertrophy, the physical exhaustion of living inside a gym, and the mental tax of calibrating tiny plate-sized portions of food while your friends are eating pizza.
If you aren't willing to fall in love with the grueling process, you have no right to the result. You have to consciously choose your struggle.
The author shares a very relatable story about this. For years, he harbored a deep fantasy of being a rock star.
I feel like everyone has that fantasy.
Totally. He daydreamed about playing guitar to screaming crowds, signing autographs, living the wild life. He spent years telling people he was going to do it, but he never actually put in the work.
He just liked the idea of it.
Yeah. Eventually, he had a harsh realization. He didn't actually want to be a rock star. He was in love with the victory, but he hated the fight.
You didn't want the pain of hauling heavy gear to empty dive bars, booking crappy gigs, practicing scales for thousands of hours, and dealing with broken guitar strings.
He realized he was just enamored with the result.
Wait, let's pause and look at this from the listener's perspective.
Okay.
It sounds incredibly dark. Isn't it deeply pessimistic to tell people that their problems will never end, that they will always suffer, and that the best they can hope for is to just pick their favorite flavor of pain?
It feels pessimistic only because it destroys the fairy tale we've been sold. But in reality, it is the most liberating psychological framework you can adopt.
How so?
When you finally accept that problems are inevitable, it frees you from the exhausting, impossible pursuit of a pain-free life. You stop feeling like a failure just because you are struggling.
Ah, I see.
It allows you to consciously pick the struggles that align with your deepest values. When you choose the pain, the joy is actually found in the climb itself, not just at the summit.
I see the logic. But there's a massive cultural roadblock preventing us from choosing our struggles wisely. We have been systematically programmed to believe that we shouldn't have to suffer at all.
We believe we deserve the results without the pain.
Because we have been told that we are inherently special.
The tyranny of exceptionalism. This is where the modern psyche really starts to fracture.
To understand this, let's talk about a guy we'll call Jimmy.
Oh, Jimmy.
Every listener knows a Jimmy. Jimmy is a delusional, deadbeat 20-something. He's always pitching these fake, world-changing business ideas. One week, it's a revolutionary new medical app. The next week, it's a completely reimagined gas pump.
He name drops constantly, talking about venture capitalists he allegedly knows.
He feeds off his family's money, maxes out credit cards, taking people to expensive restaurants to network, and produces absolutely zero tangible work.
But the truly fascinating thing about Jimmy isn't his laziness, it's his self-esteem.
His self-esteem is bulletproof. He possesses this completely unwarranted, towering sense of self-worth. If you point out the flaws in his business plans, you're just a hater who doesn't understand his genius.
If an investor rejects him, they're idiots missing out on the next Mark Zuckerberg. He lives insulated in an impenetrable bubble of his own delusion.
Jimmy is the direct byproduct of the 1970s self-esteem movement.
Right. Decades ago, psychological research indicated a correlation between high self-esteem and positive life outcomes, like better grades and lower crime rates.
But policymakers confuse correlation with causation.
They assumed that if they just artificially inflated everyone's self-esteem, success would naturally follow.
So they changed the entire educational and social framework. We got grade inflation. We got participation trophies.
We started teaching kids mantras about how everyone is uniquely exceptional and destined for greatness, regardless of their actual effort or achievement. We uncoupled the reward from the struggle.
And the data over the last few decades shows that it backfired spectacularly. Merely feeling good about yourself means absolutely nothing if you don't have a justifiable reason to feel good.
True self-worth isn't measured by how you feel about your positive traits. It is measured by how you honestly and courageously handle your negative traits.
Jimmy hides from his deep-seated insecurities and lack of discipline by inventing an imaginary world where he is already successful. He is the ultimate example of entitlement. He feels he deserves the rewards of a great life without having to endure the pain of earning them.
But entitlement isn't always about acting like you're the greatest person in the room. The source material draws a brilliant contrast between Jimmy's grandiose entitlement and the author's own experience as a teenager, which took a completely different, much darker form.
Grandiose entitlement says, I am awesome and the rest of the world sucks, therefore I deserve special treatment.
But the author developed what we can call victim-based entitlement.
Here's how it happened. He's 13 years old, sitting in biology class. He's a bit of a rebel, experimenting with drugs to cope with family issues. The assistant principal, Mr. Price, pulls him out of class and demands he open his locker.
Oh, no.
The author has a secret compartment cut into the very bottom of his backpack where he hides his marijuana. Mr. Price takes him into his office and systematically tears his bag apart. He doesn't find it at first.
You can imagine the physiological response of a 13-year-old in that moment. The massive spike in cortisol, the sweating, the sheer terror of impending doom.
It's agonizing. Mr. Price is throwing books and papers all over the floor. The author thinks he might actually get away with it. But finally, Mr. Price steps on the bottom of the empty backpack. He feels the crunch. He finds the drugs.
The fallout is catastrophic.
The kid is expelled from school. The police are involved. His parents quarantine him in the house. He loses his entire social circle. And right in the middle of this chaos, his parents announce they're getting a divorce.
It is a traumatic, world-shattering year for a kid.
Now, how does a trauma like that metabolize into entitlement?
Because in his family, negative emotions were completely stonewalled. The cultural rule of the house was to pretend everything was fine. There was no space to process the grief of the divorce or the shame of the expulsion.
Exactly. Because he couldn't process the trauma openly, he internalized it. He began to unconsciously feel that his problems were uniquely complex and completely unsolvable.
And the psychological leap here is critical. If your problems are completely unsolvable, your unconscious mind assumes that you must be uniquely defective. You start to believe that the standard rules of life don't apply to you because you are uniquely broken.
That is victim-based entitlement. It says, I suck and the rest of the world is awesome, therefore I deserve special treatment.
The external behavior looks entirely different from Jimmy, the delusional entrepreneur. Jimmy demands attention through bragging. The victim demands attention through self-pity and manufactured crises.
But if you strip away the behavioral layer, the selfish, creamy core is exactly the same. Both believe they are exceptions to the human rule. Both believe they shouldn't have to face the normal struggles of life.
Why is this such a massive epidemic right now? Why does everyone feel the need to be either uniquely brilliant or uniquely victimized?
It comes down to basic statistics colliding with modern technology. Think of a standard bell curve. On any given metric, intelligence, athletic ability, physical attractiveness, the vast majority of the human population falls right in the middle. We are, by definition, average.
To be truly exceptional at something requires an immense concentration of time and energy, which inherently means you will be average or below average at almost everything else.
But our media ecosystem completely ignores the middle of the bell curve. The internet runs on attention, and average doesn't capture attention.
The algorithms only feed us the 99.999% extremes. We only see the absolute most beautiful people, the most insanely wealthy entrepreneurs, the most talented athletes, or conversely, the most horrific tragedies and the most polarizing political outrage.
When you are fed a constant daily diet of the extreme tails of the bell curve, your brain's availability heuristic, The mental shortcut that relies on immediate examples that come to a given person's mind starts to recalibrate your baseline of reality.
You start to believe that exceptionalism is the new normal.
It's like eating an emotional diet of empty calories. This constant cultural message that everyone is extraordinary and destined for greatness is like eating a fast food burger for your brain.
It feels incredibly good in the moment.
It gives you a quick spike of dopamine. But long term, it makes you emotionally bloated, sluggish, and deeply unhealthy. When you constantly compare your normal, perfectly fine life to the curated highlight reels of billionaires and supermodels, you inevitably feel like a massive failure.
The antidote to this is what we might call the vegetable course. It's the uncomfortable truth that tastes bad at first, and you desperately want to push it away.
The vegetable course is accepting that you are average. It is accepting that the vast majority of your actions will not matter in the grand scheme of human history.
That sounds incredibly depressing to the modern ear.
It
But once you actually chew on it and digest it, it is the most liberating realization you can have. It lifts this immense crushing weight of unrealistic expectations off your shoulders.
If you aren't burdened by the need to change the world or be the absolute best at everything, you are suddenly free to just be a decent human being.
You are free to enjoy the simple, mundane, quiet things. Reading a good book, being present with a friend, mastering a small hobby, or just making dinner.
Once we accept that we aren't uniquely special, the next necessary step is to examine the internal scorecards we use to judge our daily lives. How are we measuring success and failure?
This leads us into the terrifying landscape of bad values. And to illustrate just how powerful and destructive a bad value can be, we need to look at the unbelievable story of Hiro Onoda.
Onoda's story is a masterclass in the psychology of cognitive dissonance and the meaning we attach to our struggles.
It's late 1944. The tide of World War II is violently turning against the Japanese Empire. Second Lieutenant Hiro Onoda is deployed to a small, remote island in the Philippines.
His commanding officer gives him strict, explicit orders: never surrender, never take your own life, and fight to the last man. Soon after, the American forces overwhelm the island. Most of the Japanese soldiers are killed or captured, but Onoda and a handful of men escape deep into the dense jungle.
For the next 30 years, 3 decades, Onoda wages a phantom guerrilla war. The war ends in 1945. The Americans drop thousands of leaflets over the jungle, declaring the war is over.
Onoda finds them, examines them, and concludes they are American propaganda designed to trick him.
Years later, the Japanese government drops letters and photos from his own family, begging him to come home. He convinces himself they're highly sophisticated forgeries.
He spends 30 years living like a feral animal, suffering from disease, eating insects and rodents, and occasionally shooting at local Filipino farmers, whom he believes are enemy combatants.
His brain absolutely refused to accept reality because accepting it would mean admitting that his decades of excruciating suffering were completely pointless.
Finally, in 1974, a young, eccentric Japanese hippie named Norio Suzuki travels to the Philippines specifically to find him. Amazingly, he succeeds.
He sits down with Onoda in the jungle and tells him the emperor is worried about him and the war's been over for 29 years.
Onoda's commanding officer is flown in to officially relieve him of duty. Onoda finally returns to Japan. He is treated as a national hero, a living embodiment of the samurai spirit.
But here is the crushing irony. Onoda is horrified by the country he returns to. The honorable, traditional, fiercely loyal Japan he spent 30 years fighting and suffering for is completely gone.
It has been replaced by a consumerist, capitalist, westernized society. Women are wearing Western clothes, men are working in office buildings.
And he falls into a deep depression. He was actually more depressed living comfortably in modern Japan than he ever was starving in the mosquito-infested jungle.
How does that make any logical sense?
It makes perfect sense when you understand metrics and values. In the jungle, his intense suffering meant something. It served a greater cause, loyalty to the emperor and the defense of his nation. That gave his pain profound meaning.
But returning to a society that had completely moved on rendered those 30 years of agony functionally useless.
His metric for success was entirely tied to an illusion. He chose a terrible metric to measure his life by, and it cost him his youth.
Let's bring the concept of metrics closer to home and compare two rock stars who experienced very similar traumatic events, but used entirely different metrics to process them.
Oh, this is a great comparison.
In 1983, a wildly talented guitarist named Dave Mustaine is kicked out of his band just days before they are scheduled to record their debut album. They literally hand him a bus ticket at the door and tell him to get lost.
Mustaine is completely devastated and consumed by rage. On the agonizing bus ride home, he vows to start a new band, work harder than anyone else, become wildly successful, and make his former bandmates deeply regret their decision.
That band he formed was Megadeth. They became one of the pioneers of thrash metal, sold over 25 million albums, and played sold-out arenas around the world.
By almost any objective societal standard, Dave Mustaine achieved massive, undeniable success.
Absolutely. But there's a catch. The band that kicked him out was Metallica. And Metallica went on to become one of the biggest musical acts in human history, selling over 180 million albums.
In a deeply vulnerable documentary interview in 2003, despite his millions of dollars and legions of fans, Mustaine tearfully admitted that he still felt like a complete failure.
Because his metric wasn't write great music or make a living playing guitar. His metric was be more successful than Metallica.
Yeah.
And because he failed that specific metric, his millions of albums felt worthless to him.
Now, compare that to Pete Best. Pete Best was the original drummer for the Beatles. He was considered the handsome one. The fans loved him.
But in 1962, right as the band was on the verge of exploding into global superstardom, the other members unceremoniously kicked him out and replaced him with Ringo Starr. The Beatles went on to define an era.
Best fell into a crushing depression and even attempted suicide. It's arguably the most famous firing in music history. It's hard to imagine a heavier burden of what if.
Exactly. But decades later, Best gave an interview where he stated that he was actually happier than he would have been if he had stayed in the Beatles.
Which sounds like a defense mechanism at first glance.
But it wasn't. Best explained that getting kicked out forced him down a different path. It led him to meet his wife, build a family, and create a stable, quiet life. He still played music locally, but he fundamentally changed his internal scorecard.
He decided that deep family connection and stability were a better metric for measuring a successful life than global adulation and fame.
Mustaine kept his toxic metric and remained miserable despite his millions. Best changed his metric and found peace despite losing the biggest lottery ticket in history.
This contrast brilliantly illustrates what the source material calls the self-awareness onion. Developing self-awareness is like peeling an onion. There are multiple layers, and the deeper you go, the more it makes you want to cry.
Walk me through the layers.
The first layer is simply recognizing your emotions in real time. I feel angry right now, or I feel sad. Surprisingly, many people live their entire lives completely numb to this layer, acting out their emotions without ever identifying them.
Okay, what's the second layer?
The second layer is asking why you feel that emotion. This is where we start uncovering our metrics. I feel angry because my boss criticized my presentation. The metric here is I must be universally praised to feel competent.
But the third layer is the most painful and the most important.
This is where we identify our underlying core values. You have to ask, why do I consider this a failure? How am I choosing to measure myself? Is this a good metric?
Mustaine's core value was superiority and revenge, measured by record sales. Best's value shifted to intimacy, measured by family stability.
So how do we objectively define the difference between a good value and a bad value?
Well, bad values share specific characteristics. They are reliant on external events, they are socially destructive, and most importantly, they are outside of your direct control.
Examples of bad values include pursuing pure pleasure, constantly seeking material success, needing to always be right, or desperately trying to stay positive all the time.
If you value popularity, your self-worth is entirely at the mercy of strangers. You don't control them.
Good values, on the other hand, are internally derived, socially constructive, and entirely within your immediate control. Things like honesty, vulnerability, curiosity, self-respect, or standing up for others.
You have absolute 100% control over whether you are honest in a given moment, regardless of what anyone else does.
It makes sense. Pleasure and material success aren't inherently evil, but they should be the natural side effects of living out good values, not the primary targets themselves.
But hold on, I need to challenge this framework. It's very easy to talk about choosing good values and changing our metrics when we're discussing rock stars crying over millions of dollars. But what happens when we zoom out to the real world?
Right, like real trauma.
Yeah. What if a listener is dealing with a genuinely terrible situation that was entirely inflicted upon them? A debilitating illness, a catastrophic accident, or a victim of abuse? Telling someone with profound trauma to just change their metric sounds incredibly dismissive, maybe even bordering on gaslighting.
Yeah.
How does the philosophy reconcile genuine trauma with this framework?
That is the most difficult and necessary question of this entire philosophy. And the answer requires a very sharp, very uncomfortable distinction. The framework does not suggest that trauma isn't real or that victims aren't hurting. What it argues is that while you absolutely cannot control the tragic event that happened to you, you are entirely in control of the meaning you assign to that event moving forward.
Which brings us to the crucial difference between fault and responsibility.
Exactly. In our culture, we constantly conflate the two. We assume that if something is your fault, it is your responsibility to fix it, and conversely, if it is not your fault, it is not your responsibility.
Let's break that apart because they operate in completely different tenses. Fault is past tense. It is a result of choices that have already been made, either by you or someone else. Responsibility is present tense. It is the result of the choices you are actively making right now in this exact moment.
The source material uses a fantastic analogy here. Imagine you wake up one morning, open your front door, and find a newborn baby left on your doorstep.
Now, it is absolutely not your fault that the baby is there. You didn't put it there, you didn't ask for it. But the reality is the baby is on your doorstep.
It is now 100% your responsibility to decide what happens next. You have to make a choice.
You can bring it inside and feed it. You can call emergency services. You can ignore it and step over it. Whatever you do, you are making a choice, and you are responsible for the consequences of that choice.
We are held responsible for experiences that aren't our fault all the time in life. Consider extreme historical examples. Malala Yousafzai was shot in the face by the Taliban at 14 years old simply because she wanted to go to school.
She didn't ask for that. It was entirely not her fault. She was a victim of horrific violence, but she chose how to respond to that trauma.
She took absolute responsibility for the platform the tragedy inadvertently gave her, and she used it to fight for global education, eventually winning the Nobel Peace Prize.
The text also references clinical psychology, specifically the treatment of severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. Imagine a teenager named Jack, a germaphobe whose OCD is so severe he can't leave his bedroom without wearing latex gloves.
Or Imogen, who has a compulsion to tap every surface she walks past, terrified that if she stops, her family will die.
These kids didn't choose their genetics. They didn't choose to have misfiring neurochemistry. The disorder is entirely not their fault.
But in cognitive behavioral therapy, the primary step to healing is teaching them to accept that while the neurological hand they were dealt isn't their fault, they must take absolute responsibility for managing their compulsions.
They have to choose a better value like wanting a functional social life over the bad value of surrendering to their fear. If they sit back and blame their genetics, they will never recover.
It's crucial to acknowledge here that taking responsibility is agonizingly difficult, which is why we see a massive cultural trend of people desperately trying to avoid it. The author makes a sharp observation about what he terms victimhood chic.
And to be clear, as guides to this material, we are analyzing this impartially as a psychological phenomenon, not a political one.
Yeah.
The text notes that this behavior is rampant across the entire political and social spectrum.
Right. Whether it's right-wing outrage or left-wing outrage, the psychological mechanism is identical.
Precisely. People become addicted to the moral high of feeling offended. When you declare yourself a victim of a system, a group, or an individual, you effectively pass off the responsibility for solving your problems.
This generates a powerful, temporary feeling of moral righteousness. The media landscape, often referred to as outrage porn, is specifically engineered to trigger this.
It broadcasts inflammatory content designed to make you feel victimized by the other side. This feeling of self-righteous indignation provides a quick dopamine hit, but it requires zero actual effort or democratic engagement to solve the underlying issues.
And the tragedy is that this constant hum of performative outrage drowns out the voices of actual victims who desperately need help. It's intellectually lazy.
Life is basically a giant poker game. It is not about getting dealt the best cards. Some people get dealt terrible, tragic hands, but the actual game of poker is defined by taking responsibility for playing whatever hand you hold as brilliantly as possible.
The professional players who consistently win aren't luckier than everyone else. They just make the best expected value choices with the cards they have.
But to take full responsibility and start playing our cards differently, we have to confront a terrifying reality. We have to admit that the way we've been playing the game so far might be completely wrong. We have to be willing to doubt our own deeply held beliefs.
We have to embrace uncertainty. And to illustrate the catastrophic danger of pure certainty, we need to look at the chilling story of Meredith Moran.
In the 1980s, America was swept up in the Satanic Panic. a cultural hysteria fueled by media reports of secret cults and repressed memories. Meredith Merrill was a journalist going through a difficult time, a toxic relationship, personal trauma, general unhappiness.
She started going to therapy, and under the influence of her therapist and the cultural climate, she recovered a repressed memory of her father sexually abusing her when she was a child.
She was absolutely certain it was true. She went public, confronted him, and tore her entire family apart.
She destroyed her father's life based on pure conviction.
Yes, but years later, as the science around repressed memories evolved, she slowly began to realize the horrifying truth. It was a false memory. It never happened.
Her brain had literally invented a narrative to explain away her current emotional distress, and she had accepted it as absolute fact.
And this isn't an isolated quirk. The human brain is a meaning-making machine. From an evolutionary standpoint, the brain values efficiency far more than it values accuracy. It constantly scans the environment, finds patterns, and creates narratives to help us survive.
There is a famous psychological study that perfectly demonstrates how desperately our brains want to find patterns where none exist. Researchers put subjects in a room with a panel of buttons.
They tell the subject, figure out the sequence of button pushes to turn on a light bulb and score a point.
So the subjects get to work. They push a button, nothing happens. They push another, the light goes on, they try to repeat it. Soon they are developing incredibly complex, superstitious behaviors.
They tap the red button twice, spin in a circle, tap the blue button, and the light comes on. They leave the room absolutely convinced they have cracked the code.
But the researchers were completely deceiving them. The light bulb was programmed to turn on entirely at random.
Exactly. The points had nothing to do with the buttons. But the subject's brains simply drew associations between their random actions and the random light and locked onto a false narrative.
Once we create meaning, our cognitive biases force us to cling to it, even when objective evidence contradicts us.
Which is why pure certainty is incredibly dangerous. It breeds entitlement and, when taken to the extreme, evil. People who commit atrocities rarely believe they are evil. They are absolutely terrifyingly certain of their moral righteousness.
The famous Milgram obedience experiments in the 1960s showed that perfectly normal, everyday people were willing to deliver what they believed were lethal electric shocks to another human being simply because they felt the certainty of the authority figure's rules.
When you are 100% certain you are right, you grant yourself permission to do horrible things.
This connects perfectly to a psychological concept the author coined called Manson's Law of Avoidance. We've all heard of Parkinson's Law, which states that work expands to fill the time allotted for it.
Manson's Law states, the more something threatens your identity, the more you will avoid doing it.
It's a profound insight into self-sabotage.
It explains so much. You won't sit down and write that screenplay you've been talking about for years, because actually, trying and failing would threaten your identity as an undiscovered genius.
You won't leave a toxic, abusive relationship because leaving threatens your identity as a forgiving, deeply loyal partner.
We actively avoid doing things that would genuinely improve our lives simply because they require us to shake up the rigid story we tell ourselves about who we are.
Which is why the constant cultural mandate to find yourself or build your personal brand is a psychological trap.
Wait, really? The entire self-improvement industry is built on the idea of finding your true self. Are you saying we shouldn't know who we are?
I'm saying you should actively avoid defining yourself too rigidly. The author brings in a core concept from Buddhism, which is essentially the idea that the self does not actually exist. It is a completely arbitrary mental construction.
When you let go of the rigid narrative you tell yourself about yourself, you suddenly become free to act, to change, and most importantly, to fail.
So the goal is to keep your identity as broad and mundane as possible. Don't define yourself as a rising executive star or a unique victim of circumstances. Define yourself simply. I am a student, I am a partner, I am a creator, I am a friend.
The narrower and more specific your identity becomes, the more everything in the world feels like a personal threat to it. If you define yourself merely as a person who's trying their best to learn, failure isn't an existential threat, it's just data.
And when you let go of certainty and kill your rigid identity, you finally free yourself to take action. Which brings us to the story of Pablo Picasso and the napkin.
Picasso was an old man, globally famous, sitting in a cafe in Spain. He's casually doodling on a used paper napkin while drinking his coffee. He finishes, crumples the napkin to throw it away, but a woman sitting nearby stops him.
"Excuse me," she says, "can I buy that napkin from you? I'll pay you for it." Picasso smiles and says, "Sure, that will be $20,000.
The woman is stunned. she protests. But it only took you 2 minutes to draw that.
Picasso replies, "No, ma'am. It took me over 60 years to draw this."
That interaction perfectly encapsulates the invisible architecture of success. The magnitude of any triumph is based entirely on the magnitude of the failures that preceded it.
Picasso's 2-minute doodle was backed by 6 decades of trial, error, terrible paintings, and relentless practice. If someone is better than you at something, it is almost certainly because they have failed at it more times than you have.
But as we grow from toddlers into adults, we are conditioned by the education system and society to instinctively avoid failure. We become paralyzed by the fear of looking stupid.
Yet psychological pain and failure are the fundamental requirements for growth. Think of the work of psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski. He studied the survivors of World War II in Poland, people who had endured unimaginable horrors. Mass starvation, the Holocaust, the leveling of their cities.
And what he found challenged the standard psychiatric assumptions of the time.
Completely. He found that a significant percentage of these survivors didn't just return to baseline. They believed their trauma had actually transformed them into better, more empathetic, more resilient people.
Dabrowski called this positive disintegration. The extreme suffering shattered their weak, superficial identities and forced them to rebuild a much stronger, more deeply rooted sense of self.
It's the emotional equivalent of physical resistance training. To avoid the pain is to deny yourself the opportunity for growth.
But practically speaking, when people are paralyzed by fear or anxiety, they don't know how to start failing. They sit around on the couch waiting for a lightning bolt of motivation to strike them.
The source text describes people asking VCR questions. Now, for anyone too young to remember, a VCR was a complicated machine you used to play tapes. People would stare at the flashing 12.0 on the VCR and ask, "But how do I program it?" when the answer was literally just push the buttons until it works.
Today, people ask the same type of questions about their lives. How do I drop out of law school? Or how do I ask that person out? From the outside, the answer is brutally simple. You just do it.
You walk into the office and say you quit. You walk up to the person and say hello. But from the inside, the anxiety makes it feel like an impossibly complex mathematical equation.
So how do we break out of that paralysis when the fear is overwhelming?
The author provides a brilliant mental hack called the do something principle. Most of us operate under a false assumption about how motivation works. We think it's a linear chain reaction. Emotional inspiration leads to motivation, which finally leads to action.
Right. I need to feel inspired by a video before I have the motivation to go to the gym.
Exactly. But it's not a linear chain, it's an infinite loop. Action actually creates emotional inspiration, which in turn creates motivation, which leads to more action. If you lack motivation, you just flip the script. You simply do something.
The author learned this from his high school math teacher, who told him, if you're stuck on a math problem, don't just sit there staring at it. Start writing down whatever you know, and the act of writing will eventually generate the right idea.
If you want to write a novel but feel paralyzed, force yourself to write 200 terrible, nonsensical words. The mere physical action of typing will often inspire the motivation to keep going. Action is the ultimate metric for success when you are stuck.
But taking action inherently means making choices. And making choices means saying no to the alternatives. This brings us to a crucial element of a meaningful life that modern society hates: boundaries and commitment.
The illusion of absolute freedom is a powerful drug. The author details his own experience as a digital nomad in his 20s. He traveled to 55 different countries, living out of a suitcase, making money online.
He thought that having zero commitments, the ability to go anywhere, sleep with anyone, do anything at any time, was the pinnacle of human existence.
But he eventually hit a wall of diminishing returns.
A massive wall. Bouncing from country to country, the experiences started to blur together. The thrill of arriving in your 50th country doesn't change your brain chemistry the way your first country did.
The absolute freedom became a form of emotional starvation. He found himself living in St. Petersburg, Russia, and the culture shock there fundamentally shifted his perspective on relationships and boundaries.
Russian culture is notoriously blunt. It lacks the veneer of polite deception that we rely on so heavily in the West.
In Western culture, we are terrified of offending people. We smile when we are secretly annoyed. We say, "We should totally grab coffee sometime," to people we hope to never see again. We prioritize being perceived as likable over being genuinely honest, which slowly erodes underlying trust.
But in Russia, the author went on a date, and within 3 minutes, the woman looked him in the eye and told him that what he had just said was stupid.
It was jarring and offensive at first.
But then he realized how incredibly liberating it was. Russian society survived generations of brutal economic and political hardship where trust was literally a matter of life and death. You had to know instantly who you could rely on and who was a threat.
Therefore, absolute, unvarnished honesty was the most valuable currency.
Which highlights the absolute necessity of rejection. Our consumer culture tells us to keep our options open, to say yes to every opportunity. But if you don't reject anything, you stand for nothing. You have no boundaries, and therefore you have no identity. And the place where this lack of boundaries causes the most catastrophic damage is in our romantic relationships. Let's talk about the ultimate cultural touchstone for romance, Romeo and Juliet.
We have culturally mythologized Romeo and Juliet as the pinnacle of true love. But if you look at the actual psychological mechanics of the play, it is a terrifying case study in codependency and toxic boundaries.
They meet at a party, decide their lives are meaningless without each other within hours, get secretly married the next day, fail to communicate basic information, and both end up committing suicide.
Shakespeare wasn't writing an instruction manual for romance. He was likely satirizing the absolute insanity of adolescent infatuation.
Yet our culture loves that dramatic, dizzying, all-consuming narrative. We love the idea of someone completing us. But that intense, dramatic rush stimulates the exact same neurological pathways as a cocaine high.
And like a drug addiction, that kind of unhealthy codependent love is based on two people using each other to escape their own unresolved psychological problems.
A toxic relationship is a dynamic between a victim and a saver. The victim blames others for their emotions and constantly manufactures crises to get attention and feel loved.
The saver constantly takes the blame and rushes in to fix the victim's problems, not because they are genuinely altruistic, but because fixing someone else makes them feel valued and important.
It's a closed loop where neither person is taking responsibility for their own emotional state.
A healthy relationship, by contrast, requires strong boundaries. It is two individuals taking absolute responsibility for solving their own problems while supporting the other person as they solve theirs.
You must be willing to say no to your partner, and you must be willing to hear no from them without it destroying the relationship. Honest conflict is actually necessary to determine who is there unconditionally versus who is just there for the emotional benefits.
The author compares trust in a relationship to a china plate. If a relationship has strong boundaries and trust is broken once, say a significant lie or a betrayal, it's like dropping the plate.
It breaks, but with a lot of careful work and therapy, you can glue the pieces back together. The plate will have visible cracks, but it will still function.
However, if you are in a toxic relationship with no boundaries and the trust is broken repeatedly, it's like stomping on the plate over and over again. Eventually, it shatters into fine dust.
There aren't enough pieces left to glue back together. The only way to rebuild trust is for the person who broke it to acknowledge their bad values and build a consistent, undeniable track record of changed behavior over a long period of time. Words are completely useless. Action is the only metric.
And this brings us to the ultimate rejection of alternatives, the act of commitment. Whether it is committing to a marriage, a specific career path, or a geographic community, commitment inherently narrows your freedom.
But in exchange, it provides incredible depth. And depth is where the actual meaning of life is buried.
That is the perfect transition to the final, most profound concept of this entire philosophy. Because the act of committing is an acceptance of limitation. It is acknowledging that you cannot do everything and be everyone.
And this voluntary limitation mirrors the ultimate, inescapable limitation we all face. I want to slow down here and recount a deeply personal, tragic story from the source material. When the author was 19 years old, he had a good friend named Josh.
Josh was a bit older, more confident, a musician. He was the guy the author looked up to.
One night, they were at a party at a cliffside lake in Texas. They were drinking, and Josh pointed to a 30-foot cliff dropping into the pitch-black water and asked if the author was going to jump.
Later that night, the author was walking back up the trail to the house and bumped into Josh heading down toward the water. He asked Josh where he could find him later.
Josh smiled and said, "Seek the truth for yourself and I will meet you there."
A haunting final exchange.
It really was. Because Josh jumped off that cliff in the dark. The autopsy later suggested that the impact, combined with dehydration, caused his legs to cramp. He couldn't swim well to begin with. He drowned in the darkness. It took scuba divers 3 hours to find his body the next morning.
The author was completely devastated. He fell into a profound, paralyzing depression. He stopped attending classes, stopped talking to friends.
But one night, he had a vivid dream where Josh appeared to him and asked a devastating question. "Why do you care that I'm dead when you're still so afraid to live.
That is a psychological breaking point.
It woke him up. He realized that if death is inevitable, if there is ultimately no objective reason to do anything in the grand scheme of the cosmos, then there is also absolutely no reason not to do anything.
He realized that by hiding in his apartment, smoking weed, and avoiding anything that was painful or uncomfortable, he was essentially avoiding being alive.
He dropped his stoner habits, transferred to a better college, started working out, forced himself to talk to people, and completely transformed his trajectory. Josh's tragic death became the catalyst for the author's entire adult life.
It forced him to strip away the trivial distractions and confront his own mortality head-on. Which brings us to the philosophical underpinning of all of this. Ernest Becker's Pulitzer-winning book, The Denial of Death.
The Becker was an anthropologist who argued that human beings are fundamentally unique because we are the only animals capable of conceptualizing our own reality. A dog just exists in the present.
But humans can imagine a future, and more terrifyingly, we can imagine a future without us in it. We recognize our physical selves will inevitably decay and die.
And because the knowledge of our impending physical death is too terrifying to process on a daily basis, Becker argued that we build what he called immortality projects.
Exactly. We try to construct a conceptual self, an identity or a legacy that we believe will live forever. We put our names on massive buildings, we write books, we try to conquer nations, or on a smaller scale, we desperately try to raise perfect children or amass wealth.
All hoping that our influence will outlive our physical bodies. Almost all of human civilization, our religions, our politics, our obsessive drive for status, is essentially a collection of immortality projects designed to distract us from the underlying terror of death.
Which means our immortality projects are our values. And when those projects fail, when the business goes bankrupt, or the legacy is tarnished, the death terror creeps back in, and we experience profound psychological crises.
Becker realized on his own deathbed that instead of desperately trying to build these fragile projects, we should just become deeply comfortable with the reality of our own death. He called it the bitter antidote.
Because once you fully accept that you are going to die and that most of what you do will be forgotten, the root anxiety driving all your frivolous, ego-driven ambitions loses its power.
You are suddenly free to choose your values based on what actually matters right now, rather than what will make you look important later.
The author details this visceral experience he had traveling to the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa to test this theory on himself. He hikes out to the edge of a sheer cliff. It's a 50-yard drop straight down to the violent ocean below. The wind is screaming.
As he walks toward the edge, his body's natural radar starts panicking. He feels that invisible magnetic pull dragging him backward, the evolutionary imperative to survive screaming in his brain.
But he forces himself to inch closer. 3 feet, 2 feet, 1 foot. He is looking straight down the vertical rock face. His body is physically shuddering. His mind is in total rebellion.
But he forces himself to sit down. He dangles his legs over the abyss. He forces himself to consciously interface with his own mortality.
He embraces the fear of the void until it passes through him, leaving behind a kind of euphoric mindfulness.
He looks out at the endless horizon, listening to the crashing waves, and he just laughs. Because confronting death obliterates all the fragile, superficial values we cling to every day.
When you look over the edge of the cliff, you don't care about how many followers you have on social media. You don't care about the awkward thing you said at a party 5 years ago.
Death is the only certainty we have. Therefore, it is the only reliable compass by which we should measure our values. It asks the only important question: what is your actual legacy? How will the people around you be slightly better off because you were here?
If we pull all of these threads together and synthesize the journey, we have to swallow the bitter vegetable course and accept that we aren't uniquely special.
We have to understand the hedonic treadmill and choose our daily struggles wisely, recognizing that happiness is the active process of solving problems, not avoiding them.
We must reject victimhood chic and take absolute radical responsibility for our current emotional state, regardless of whose fault it is. We need to fiercely doubt our own certainties, kill our rigid identities, and accept that our brains are biased, meaning-making machines.
When we are paralyzed, we have to use the do something principle, acting before we feel motivated. We must embrace rejection and build firm boundaries to foster genuine trust. And above all, we must keep the unyielding reality of our death front and center.
It brings us right back to the paradox we started with. Human emotions and values are not clean, binary algorithms. They are messy, highly subjective, and deeply prone to the feedback loop from hell.
But if you can wade into that quicksand, Accept the negative friction of life and stop trying so desperately to force a positive outcome. You actually find solid ground.
Letting go of the desperate need to feel good all the time is the only way to genuinely feel good.
So as you go back to your day, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Look closely at the things you care about the most right now. The job promotion you are losing sleep over, the political argument you are having online, the status symbol you're working overtime to buy.
Are those things genuinely making your life and the lives of the people you love better?
Or are they just your own personal immortality projects?
Oh.
Clever distractions designed by your ego to keep you from facing the fact that your time here is strictly limited.